So, how do you get what you want in any situation? How do you get what you want? I mean, suppose you go to Wendy's and you want to order a sandwich. Now, you know what you want, don't you? I mean, I know what I want. I want a spicy chicken sandwich with pickles and mustard only. And I know what Emily wants. She wants a single cheeseburger, no onions, no mayo, add ketchup. Now, how do I get what I want? Well, somehow I have to communicate my wishes to the customer service representative. But how? I mean, I do have a number of communication options open to me. I could act it out. Could play charades. My acting skills aren't really very keen. I could probably communicate spicy and chicken and sandwich because everybody recognizes the international sign for spicy and for chicken. And it's easy to mime eating a sandwich, but the miming I'd have to give to the clerk to guess pickles and mustard might become undignified. Play 20 questions, but that would take a really long time. It's owing to the large number of menu items, the large number of possible combinations of ingredients. It'd take far more than 20 questions to get the order right. We had a friend in Houston who graduated from Rice University, and when he was a student at Rice, living in the dorms, they used to make frequent trips to Jack in the Box. And this was back when the drive-through speaker at Jack in the Box was in the shape of a clown head. And the employees at the restaurant had been well trained in the art of suggestive sales. So every time they ordered something, no matter what it was, the clown would always suggest one more thing. And these guys found that really annoying. So they began to devise a plan to try to prevent the clown from making a sales suggestion. They made it their goal to thwart the clown. They took up a collection at the dorm. They went to Jack in the Box with the intention of going into the drive-thru and ordering one of everything. Because then they thought, if we order one of everything, there won't be anything left for the clown to suggest. So they studied the menu very carefully. They took careful notes, making sure to cover all their bases because they didn't want to leave anything out. They put together a spreadsheet on which they could cross-check every item and make sure that there was no duplication, that they had left absolutely nothing off. And then when the fateful hour came, they loaded up in their car with their collected money in hand, and they systematically read out their ordering one of everything on the menu. And when they had finished and were satisfied with themselves, they were completely taken by surprise and deflated and somewhat annoyed when the clown answered back to them and asked, "Would you like cream with that coffee?" So no, 20 questions wouldn't be enough. You can't be coy and get what you want. At least not without a great deal of frustration. Now, there are other forms of communication you could try: smoke signals, carrier pigeon, wind talkers, semaphore, heliograph, whale song, Morse code, interpretive dance. However, every one of those overlooks the most obvious choice. Because the best possible way to get what you want is by asking for it. Clearly, concisely, succinctly. And if I tell the clerk at Wendy's what I want and he enters the information correctly and the cook reads it correctly, chances are I'll get what I asked for. Although with the Wendy's in Craig, I'm not so sure. Last time we were there, everything was broken. No one was in uniform. Half the people were in their pajamas and they were growing their own mushrooms in the restroom. So don't get me wrong. I know that this is a crude analogy. The kingdom of God is not a fast food restaurant. And God is certainly not a minimum wage employee who's required to answer to us under the rationale that the customer is always right. But don't miss the point that I'm trying to make. And that is that the simplest and surest way to get what you want in any given transaction is to know what you want and ask for it. And according to Jesus, that isn't so just with people, it's so with God also. In Luke 11, Jesus is answering a question that had been brought to him by the apostles. A few days or a few weeks prior to this, the apostles had attempted to cast a demon out of a boy and they had failed. So Jesus cast the demon out. Then later, when the apostles were alone together with Jesus, they asked him, Lord, why were we unable to cast it out? And in his response, Jesus said, well, your failure is tied to a shortcoming in your prayer life. So sometime later, his disciples came to him and said, Lord, teach us to pray. And what's recorded in Luke 11 is Jesus' response. And that has been the topic of my lessons over the last few weeks. Now, last week we did a survey of the most frequently recurring theme in Jesus' response, and that is that Jesus presents prayer not as something that is thought, but as something that is done. Prayer, as it is presented by Jesus, is an act of faith. Prayer is faithing, ABC. Prayer is action, based on belief, sustained by confidence in God. And in Luke 11, the action that Jesus most frequently commends to us is asking, because it does no good whatsoever to believe in prayer if one does not at some point actually pray. As James says in James 4:2, you have not because you ask not. Now, as I said last week, that may seem pretty basic. But that was apparently not basic to the understanding of the people to whom Jesus was writing, because according to James, the instinct of his readers was that when they wanted something, they would do just about anything to get it, except pray. They would beg, borrow, and steal to get what they wanted. And what James says in James 4:2 is, if you want something, try asking for it. And that's what Jesus says about 5 different ways in Luke 11 as well. That the most important thing to remember about prayer is to do it. And that the most fundamental aspect to prayer is the aspect of asking. That is, if you want something from God, ask for it. Now, that was last week's lesson. This week, I want to focus on what Jesus says in Luke 11 about how we should ask. Because there are some things that Jesus says in this passage that are kind of surprising. Let's begin with Luke 11, starting in verse 5. Then Jesus said to them, suppose you have a friend, and you go to him at midnight and say, friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread. A friend of mine on a journey has come to me, and I have no food to offer him. And suppose the one inside answers, don't bother me. The door is already locked and my children and I are in bed. I can't get up and give you anything. I tell you, even though he will not get up and give it to you because of friendship's sake, yet because of your persistence, he will surely get up and give you as much as you need. Now, the analogy that Jesus uses here is less crude than the one I started with. But the point of both analogies, or at least the point I want to emphasize, is the same. As Luke 11:5-8 applies to prayer, Jesus says, when you pray, know what you want and ask for it. And in this regard, I think that my Wendy's analogy works pretty well, because when the prayer in question goes to God in the middle of the night, he knows what he wants. He wants bread, 3 loaves of it. And he wants it now, because now is when it matters. Now is when his guests have arrived. And now is when he needs to serve them bread in order to be a good host. So he goes urgently to his friend at his time of need and says, lend me 3 loaves of bread. And Jesus makes it clear by what he says next that the specific nature of that request isn't dire. It isn't life or death. This is a cultural need for a cultural custom. The man in the parable isn't wanting for food. He isn't starving. He isn't Mother Hubbard. His cupboard isn't bare. He isn't jobless. His family isn't starving. No, he's just out of bread. And his guests have arrived unexpectedly. And bread is the food that is the sign of good hospitality in first century Palestine. If you have any good sense of social grace, any good sense of manners in the culture of Jesus' day, then you know that when guests arrive, the thing to do is to serve them bread. Not because they're hungry necessarily, but because it's expected. And it's undignified to serve them anything other than bread. And this man knows what he wants. Bread. 3 loaves. And he asks for that. And Jesus, in the verses that follow, says that that's the right thing to do. Luke 11, 9 through 13, and so I say to you, ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, everyone who seeks finds, and to everyone who knocks, the door will be opened. Which of you fathers, if your son asks for a fish, will give him a snake instead? Or if he asks for an egg, will give him a scorpion? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him? If you want an egg, Jesus says, ask for an egg. If you want a fish, ask for a fish. And in a similar discourse in Matthew 7:9, Jesus says, if you want bread, ask for bread. And if bread is really what you want, keep asking and don't stop asking till you get bread. And don't accept any substitutions, because the Father, according to Jesus, doesn't make substitutions. Now, this is something I hear people constantly say. Well, I asked God for what I wanted, but he gave me what I needed. And years later, I figured out that if he had given me what I asked for, things wouldn't have gone nearly as well as they have gone. Well, I don't deny that God is wiser than we are, and that he knows better than we do what we need and what's good for us. And I also don't deny that God sometimes gives us things that we don't ask for, things that we don't want or don't think we want, but that he wants us to have. But according to Jesus, both here and in Matthew 7, those gifts from God, those impartations, have nothing to do with the things that we asked for in prayer. They're completely unrelated. God does not substitute one thing for another. Well, I asked for pleasure and God gave me pain instead. And I later figured out that it was because God had something he wanted to teach me, something that I couldn't learn from the pleasure that I sought, something that I could only learn from the pain. Well, God may have sent you the pain, but it wasn't because you asked for the pleasure. And when you imagine that the two are related, what you're imagining is that God did the very thing that Jesus says God will not do. I asked for a fish and God gave me a snake instead. I asked for an egg and God gave me a scorpion instead. I asked for bread and God gave me a stone instead. No, he didn't. No, he didn't, because if he did, Jesus is a liar. Because Jesus says God doesn't do that. God doesn't make substitutions, not even to teach you a lesson. But all of my life, people have been telling me that if you ask for one thing and get another, that you should accept that as God's answer because God is trying to teach you something. And that if you don't accept snake for fish or scorpion for egg or stone for bread as God's answer, then you're just being impertinent. But what I'm telling you today is Jesus encourages us to be impertinent. What Jesus says is, know what you want and ask for that. And if what you're asking for is what you really want, then keep on asking till you get it. Because even though what you want may not be high on God's priority list, He'll give it to you anyway if you ask Him persistently. Now, let's stop and understand this word persistence. Because understanding this word is key to understanding what Jesus is saying here. Because the Greek word that's translated persistence here means more than merely stick-to-itiveness. The Greek word in Luke 11:8 is the word onedia. It's made up of two words. The first word is anu, which is a negative particle meaning not, anti, or without. And the second word is idios, which means a sense of shame, honor, or modesty, bashfulness, reverence, regard for others, or respect. And when you put the two together, what the word means is shamelessly, immodestly, undignly, which is actually it's obscure now, but it's the adverbial form of undignified. Unblushingly, blatantly, impudently. So, for instance, in the Amplified Bible here, Luke 8 reads, I tell you, although he will not get up and supply him anything because he is his friend, because of his shameless persistence and insistence, he will get up and give him as much as he needs. The CEB has brashness. The CEV reads, he may not get up to give you the bread just because you are his friend, but he will get up and give you as much as you need simply because you are not ashamed to keep on asking. Darby has shamelessness. Graeber has insistent request. Lexham reads impudence. Wycliffe has improbity for your continual asking. The Anglo-Saxon Bible of 995 AD, and you know, we have lost some words in the English language that could be really useful to us sometimes. The word here in the Anglo-Saxon is onrope, which means importunate clamor, importunity, abusive language, reproach. In Braid Scott, the word fash means to make angry, to enrage, to interfere with, to trouble, to annoy, to bother, to vex, to afflict, to give pains. And in the Braid Scott's Bible, in Luke 11, when the man knocks on the door, the neighbor says, fash me na. But when the neighbor relents and gets up and gives him the bread, it says that he gave him his bread because of his fashiousness. And Liddell Scott defines this word as shamelessness, impudence, effrontery, and even unforgivingness in the sense of a prosecutor being unrelenting in the way that he presses a case in a court of law. And that is exactly the kind of mindset, the kind of outlook, the kind of approach to prayer that Jesus says we should adopt, that we should know what we want and ask for it. And that we should keep asking for it until we get it, even when doing so seems impertinent, because according to Jesus, a degree of impertinence among his followers is a good thing. Now, that may sound strange to you. That may sound odd. It may strike you as difficult to accept or difficult to appreciate. But we see examples of it throughout the Bible presented in a positive light. For instance, look at Genesis 15. Here we have a conversation between Abraham and God. That is, we have an example of one of the prayers of Abraham. Now, this is 3 chapters after we've been introduced to Abraham. This is 3 chapters after God called Abraham, and Abraham faithed. God had come to Abraham while Abraham was a pagan, living among pagans. And he said to him, I want you to leave these pagans, even your own family, even your own father, and come follow me. And Abraham did. And since that time, there's been a famine in Canaan. Abraham has been to Egypt and back. Abraham and Lot have separated. Lot and his family were taken captive in the War of the 9 Kings. Abraham took his armies and rescued Lot. And Abraham had had his encounter with Melchizedek as he returned from that war. So Abraham and God have been through quite a lot together. And Abraham has been faithful to God in various ways over that time. As we read in Genesis 15:6, Abraham faithed in the Lord, and the Lord credited his faithing to him as righteousness. Yet Abraham's faithfulness, even his faithfulness unto righteousness, does not keep him from being impertinent with God. Because in the very next verse, God says to Abraham, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur Chaldea to give you this land and take possession of it. And Abraham replies, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will take possession of it? That is, God says to Abraham, I am giving you this land. And Abraham says, prove it. Now that's impertinent. You might think that God would take exception to that, but he doesn't. Rather, in response to Abraham's impudent request, God does exactly what Abraham asked him to do. He proves himself to Abraham. And the proof that God offers, I've talked to you about this before, but it's odd to our way of thinking. But what God does to prove himself to Abraham in Genesis 15 is one of the most extraordinary things in the whole Bible. God tells Abraham to bring him a number of animals, kill them, split their carcasses in half, and then he instructs him to wait there between the carcass halves. Now, this seems like a weird thing for God to do, but what he's doing is a specific and distinct custom that has meaning, and Abraham knows, he understands the custom. Because in the ancient Near East, kings were considered gods of a sort. And as such, they had no one to hold them accountable for keeping their word. So when kings wanted to bind an oath on themselves, they had no recourse but to bind an oath by putting their own sovereignty, that is, their own existence as God kings, on the line. That's the force of the ritual that's in view in Genesis 15. Abraham is the king of Canaan. But God is the king of the universe, and he has no means to swear an oath except by his own existence, which is exactly what God does in Genesis 15, because when he comes and appears before Abraham and passes between those carcass halves, what he is saying by that action is, Abraham, if I fail to keep my word to you, may I be rent asunder, just as these animals have been rent asunder. If I fail to keep my word, may I cease to be the Lord. May the I am not be. May I cease to exist as the sovereign being if I fail to keep my word to you. That is what God responds to Abraham there when Abraham was so impertinent with him. And make no mistake about it, Abraham was impertinent, but he knew what he wanted. And he wanted proof that God would keep his word, so he asked for it. And God gave it to him. Which, by the way, I think casts a different light on the actions of Thomas after the resurrection of Christ. Thomas has been taking a bad rap for his impertinence, even having been named Doubting Thomas. But his request wasn't so different from the request of Abraham, which, by the way, Bob, feel free to get up and walk around or move, do whatever you need to do. It's fine. Thomas wanted proof that Jesus had, in fact, risen from the dead. And he said, I will not faith in the resurrection of Christ till I put my finger in his hand and my hand in his side. And we read that and we say, well, how dare he? Shame on him. Well, Thomas knew what he wanted, and he asked for it. And according to Jesus in Luke 11:8, that isn't shameful, it's shameless. And criticize Thomas all you want, he got what he asked for. Jesus subjected himself to the test. Now, in these two examples, we don't see the kind of persistence and repeated asking of the sort that Jesus refers to in Luke 11:5-8, but we do see that brashness, that boldness that Jesus commands to us in the text. And if you're looking for examples of the kind of dogged persistence that's in view in Luke 11, how about Abraham's prayers on behalf of Sodom in Genesis 18? Now, you're all familiar with that story. There, God told Abraham that he was intent on destroying the city of Sodom because of the wickedness of that city. And Abraham, who has empathy for the people there, wants God to reconsider. So he goes to God 6 times and prays that God will not destroy the city. Only each time he bargains with God for a lower standard by which to judge the righteousness of the city. The first time he pleads that God would spare the city if 50 righteous people are found there. The second time he lowers the number to 45, then to 40, then to 30, then to 20, then to 10. And every time God relents. Now, that approach to prayer is impertinent indeed. And by all appearances, God seems to honor that kind of impertinence. We see a number of examples of this kind of dogged insistence in prayer. On the night before he was to meet face to face with his brother Esau, Jacob wrestled with God all night long. Well, why did he wrestle all night? Well, because Jacob wanted something from God that he wasn't getting, and he knew what that something was. Jacob knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted a blessing from God. He knew that the blessings he had stolen weren't really his. He wanted the genuine article. He wanted a blessing from God. And he wasn't going to let God go. He wouldn't let go of God until he got it. And God honored Jacob's impertinence by giving him the blessing that he asked for. And there are more examples that I could give. In Job 28-31, Job goes on for 4 chapters protesting his innocence before God and demanding that God give him a hearing, an evidentiary hearing, in which he could argue his case before God. But he doesn't even wait for God to grant him the hearing. He just goes ahead and starts presenting his case. And he demands that God listen to him. Well, God has a thing or two to say to Job. And in his response to Job, he puts Job in his place. But that isn't the end of the story, because it's in his response to Job's impertinence that God brings Job's ordeal to an end and restores his life to him, giving him a new lease on life. He restores his health, he restores his wealth, and he gives him a new family. Daniel prayed continually for 21 days until Gabriel came and answered his prayer directly. Hannah prayed for years that God would give her a son, and at long last, God gave her Samuel. Simeon prayed for years that he would see the Messiah before he died. And when Jesus was presented in the temple, when he was 8 days old, Simeon prayed, "Now, Lord, your servant can die in peace." When Peter was arrested for preaching the gospel, the church met night and day, praying without ceasing that he would be released, and against all odds, by the direct hand of God, he was released. Now, don't misunderstand me. Praying with persistence is not the magic bullet of prayer. You can pray with persistence and still get no for an answer. David prayed persistently that his son would be healed, and his son died. Paul prayed persistently that his thorn in the flesh would be taken away, and it's unclear at best whether that ever happened. Jesus prayed persistently that the cup of the crucifixion would be taken away from him, going back 3 times to repeat his prayer, and the answer was no. Nobody bats 1,000 when it comes to prayer, not even Jesus. Nevertheless, don't miss the point. On the heels of a very public failure, a failure which Jesus attributed to their prayer lives, the apostles came to Jesus and said, "Lord, teach us to pray." And one of the things that Jesus says to them in reply is, you need to show a little more confidence in God when you pray. And confidence in God is reflected in the confidence we have to stand flat on our feet before God and say, "I know what I want from you. And I feel free to tell you what that is." Know what you want and ask for it. Now, this brings us to where we ended last week, where we've ended every lesson for the last 4 or 5 weeks. In Acts 4, and Peter and John find themselves on trial before the Sanhedrin. And the high priest threatened them under penalty of law, warning them to cease and desist from preaching in the name of Jesus. And as I pointed out several times, in this trial, real jeopardy attaches to Peter and John, jeopardy more extreme and more capricious than you or I can easily understand or appreciate. Then in Acts 4, 23 through 24, it says, when they were released, they went to the other apostles and reported what the chief priests and elders had said to them. And when they heard it, they lifted their voices together to God and said, "Sovereign Lord, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them, who through the mouth of our father David, your servant, said by the Holy Spirit, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth made their position very clear when their rulers conspired together against the Lord and against his anointed one. For in this very city, Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, conspired against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, to do what by your hand and by your plan you foreordained had to be done. Accordingly, Lord, look upon their new threats and grant to your servants to continue to speak your word with all boldness, while you stretch out your hand to heal, and signs and wonders are performed through the name of your holy servant Jesus." Beloved, the first time that Jesus brought a lesson to the apostles about how to pray in Matthew 6, his teaching didn't take. But the second time in Luke 11, it did. And one of the things Jesus said to the disciples in Luke 11 was, when you pray, know what you want and ask for it, And don't give up asking for it. Keep asking till you get it. And in Acts 4, they found themselves in need of something. And they defined their need themselves. They defined their need very narrowly. Who knows what they could have asked for? But they knew exactly what they wanted from God, and they asked that. Now, what they asked for is not what I would have asked for. At least I don't think it's what I would have asked for. But they asked for what they wanted, and they got it. So we'll explore that next week, about what the apostles asked for, why they asked it, and how that prayer was answered. And that's where we'll pick up next week. That's my lesson for today.